Welcome everyone. Today in Rich and Spiritual presents My Search for Truth, Volume 1st by Henry Thomas Hamblin. Chapter 1, Earliest Impressions. I come of a deeply religious family. My father was the youngest son of the Reverend Joseph Hamblin, one-time Baptist minister at Foots Cray, Kent, who lies buried in the little churchyard in front of Foots Cray Chapel. Father was the only one in his family who followed the religious life. Why his two brothers and sister did not do so, I cannot say. Yet my father, although religious, never followed in his father's footsteps by entering the ministry. He was not without talent, and had he possessed more self-assurance he might have done as well as some ministers whom I have known. But father was too gentle and timid to take a leading part in the church, so he never got beyond serving as a deacon. Mother was of quite different caliber. She was capable of holding her own in any situation. She it was who ruled our home, but although she used a cane to some effect at times, hers was a reign of love. We children loved her more than we did father, although he did not cane us and was terribly upset whenever we were punished. My earliest recollections carry me back to the time when I was being prompted by mother as I stumblingly said the child's prayer, "Gentle Jesus, meek and mild, look upon a little child, pity my simplicity, suffer me to come to thee." I also remember my father taking me for walks and shewing me various wild flowers, and telling me how to recognize the songs of the different birds, for being a countryman he knew them all. He used to tell me about God and how that not a sparrow could fall to the ground without our Heavenly Father knowing about it. He told me stories about Jesus and what he did and said while on earth. He taught me, too, to sing the hymn, "When mothers of Salem, their children brought to Jesus." I used to think a lot about Jesus. He was very real to me, and I greatly wished that I could see him and be like the children of Salem whom he took in his arms and blessed. It would have been lovely, I thought. I had one brother and one sister, both older than myself, and father used to gather us children around him and teach us to sing various hymns, such as children could understand. On Sunday evenings we had family worship. Father read from the Bible, after which we all knelt down. I can still recall how hard the floor was, while he prayed for us long and earnestly, each one individually by name. I also remember being alone with mother, sitting on a little stool beside her chair. She would hold my hand while she talked to me about Jesus, who was the friend of little boys like me. She said that when I did things which were wrong I made Jesus very sad and unhappy. I could not understand how this could be, for Jesus was not there, having gone to heaven to sit on a throne at God's right hand, but I was willing to take mother's word for it. Father spent a lot of time in prayer for us children. We could hear his moans and groans all over the house, although we could not distinguish his actual words. But once, when I was near the door of his room, I did hear enough to know that he was pleading with God to save us children from perishing before it was too late. Of course, we children went to Sunday school. I, being the youngest, went in the infants' class and was taught by a melancholy man whose voice was cast in such mournful tones that he might have been the angel mentioned in Revelation 8 which flew through the midst of heaven, saying in a loud voice, "Woe, woe, woe, to the inhabitants of the earth." In appearance my teacher looked like a funeral mute, and when he spoke it was as though the much dreaded end of the world had come and that the whole population was sliding downwards into the lake of fire and brimstone, while he shouted out, "Woe, woe," just as a parting shot. Those indeed were dreadful days as regards theology and doctrine. However, as soon as I could read fairly well I was transferred to the big school and put in a class presided over by a very likable young man. We grew quite fond of our teacher, for he did not cry, "Woe, woe," but told us all sorts of interesting things which he illustrated by means of rough sketches which he made on pieces of paper. One day, however, the superintendent came along and caught our teacher during one of his demonstrations, and severely censured him for not using the stereotyped lessons which were issued by the Sunday School Union. The young man refused to be regimented and thus turned into a mere pawn, so he left. In his place we had the son of a baking powder manufacturer, one of the two well-to-do or comparatively rich men of our church. He was, however, quite a different type of teacher and was evidently tarred with the same brush as was the infants' class leader, for he told us that evil was the reality. He said that if you put a bad plum in with a basket of good plums, they will all be made bad. Never would the good plums make the bad plum good. No, the bad plum will always cause the good ones to rot. So he said that God demanded that a sacrifice should be made, a human sacrifice which would put everything right and appease his anger, thus preventing him from punishing us for our sins which we had committed, owing to this principle of evil. The teacher did not point out, however, that we could not possibly have been responsible, seeing that his so-called principle of evil existed long before we were born. There was a boy in the class named Thomas, and he and I together delighted in asking our teacher awkward questions. For instance, we asked him how it was possible that plums still went bad, if what he said was true. That was a poser for him, and I cannot remember that he ever answered it. On another occasion he spent a lot of time trying to explain the doctrine of the Trinity. Thomas, bluntly telling him that such a thing was impossible, demanded, "How can one person be three persons, and how can three persons be one person?" The teacher could not answer the question. Quite obviously, he did not know. Thomas was triumphant. Looking back on these and similar incidents, it seems incredible that an untrained Sunday school teacher should have been entrusted with the responsible task of instructing little boys in such a difficult doctrine as that of the Trinity, especially as he knew nothing about it himself. If the authorities considered it advisable to teach such abstruse theological tenets to children, one would have thought that they would have entrusted the work to well-trained theologians, not to raw, unlearned men who were quite ignorant of the subject. But perhaps there were not many boys of Thomas's caliber. I do not, however, think that any of our ministers would have been capable of training the Sunday school teachers in the mystery of the Trinity, simply because they did not understand it themselves. I have never met anyone who did. Actually, of course, the real meaning is this: God transcendent is God the Father, God immanent is God the Son, God, the Holy Spirit is the Holy Breath. Without the Son, God within us, we can do nothing. Through Him, God immanent, we are able to approach the Father, God transcendent, and we are sustained by the Holy Spirit, the breath of God. Another recollection. Our teacher called us together for a confidential talk. He told us that it was time that we were saved. Jesus had died to save us from being eternally punished by the wrath of God, who had demanded a sacrifice of appeasement, yet this did not take effect if we were not saved. We were saved, and yet we were not saved. That was all we could make out of it. He declared that because we were not saved, we might go to hell at any moment, where we would be tortured forever. He added that we might die through being run over by a cart or through sudden illness, or we might even be struck dead in the midst of our sins by an angry God. We were reminded that one or two of the boys belonging to the Sunday school had died recently, and our teacher advised us to make up our minds quickly before it was too late. By this time I was thoroughly frightened and thought that the sooner I became saved, the better. But Thomas was not convinced. He argued that we were not responsible for being sinful, therefore why did God want to punish us? The teacher replied, "Oh, but we are responsible. We are given free choice, and if we choose evil we must be punished for it." But Thomas produced a text which he said he had come across by accident, and which ran as follows: "Behold, I was shapen in iniquity, and in sin did my mother conceive me. Now, said Thomas, if that is the case, we are not responsible, therefore God has no right to punish us. Even an ordinary man would not do such a thing. Again Thomas had got the better of the argument, and again the teacher was brought to a complete standstill. About this time news came to us that our beloved, late teacher had been killed in a big earthquake at San Francisco. As he ran out to escape from a large building, some masonry fell upon him which killed him instantly. I expressed the fear to Thomas that perhaps our beloved ex-teacher had gone to hell, seeing that he was so unorthodox that he had been forced to resign from the Sunday school. But Thomas would not agree. He said that if there was a hell it would be for the really wicked, and that there would be a heaven of some sort for decent and good people, even if they were unorthodox. This comforted me not a little, in spite of the fact that it sounded like heresy to me. I do not know what became of Thomas, and I have often wondered how he turned out. He could never have become a canting hypocrite, that is certain. He was fair and just and wise, far beyond his years, and had a much better idea of God than any of our so-called teachers possessed. Thomas was intellectually honest, which was not the case, I am afraid, with some of the theologians and teachers of doctrine of the time of which I write. However, although the teaching was muddle-headed, the people themselves were good and kind, for Victorian people had many virtues which are sadly lacking today. I have mentioned these incidents in order that the reader may form some sort of picture of the religious background of my early years, and also that my younger readers may glean some idea of the dreadful ideas of God which prevailed in those far-off days some 70 years ago. On the other hand, it may well be asked, why do you give us this account of your early childhood, for you could not possibly have been a seeker after truth at such an early age? That is certainly true, so far as conscious seeking was concerned. But I think that we are seekers the whole of our life through, although we may be quite unconscious of the fact. There is something within us which is always seeking satisfaction. We may seek it in worldly and fleshly things, or even in highly intellectual pursuits, for we are as it were driven forward by desire. We may imagine that we really can find satisfaction in having our hopes and desires realized, but of course we find that contentment is as far off as ever. We do not know at the time that what we are really seeking is God, and that God alone can satisfy our longings. Thus, although we may be seeking satisfaction in the things of this life, yet actually we are seeking God, although we do not know at the time that we are doing so. But when we have arrived, even though it be but to a small degree, we begin to realize that although we may seem to have been the seeker and that everything depended upon our searching, yet actually God has been seeking us and drawing us to Himself by the cords of His love. Looking back on my life, it seems to me that it has been like a magnet attracting steel filings. God has been drawing me, as indeed He draws all His children, all the time, even from my earliest years. Without being aware of the fact, my so-called seeking has really been my response to God's attracting power of love. Therefore this drawing by God must have begun as soon as my life on this earth began. Consequently, it is necessary to recount these incidents of my early life in order to trace the way in which God has led and attracted me. We all respond to this drawing process in different ways according to our individual makeup, circumstances, home life, and the early teaching which we receive. It must not be thought, however, that because ours was a religious home, with father following the religious life and mother also doing the same only in a far less conspicuous way, that we children were a trio of saints. Far from it. We were no better than we ought to have been, in fact oftentimes much worse. I can remember our little mother saying more than once that she wished she could run away and leave us, because we were so naughty. I can also remember her saying that we should be sorry someday when she was gone. As Mother was a woman of much spirit and strength of will, our misbehavior must have been pretty bad to make her say such things. As our parents were Baptists, we children were not baptized when we were infants, but had to wait for believers' baptism. When a boy or girl was old enough to know his or her own mind, and if he or she made a profession of faith and accepted a certain formula of doctrine, then baptism was granted and membership of the church allowed. My brother, being the eldest, was the first to pass through this initiation. My sister followed, but I, being very much younger, had to wait several years. I am not quite sure of the actual sequence of events during this period of my life, but I think that it must have been before I was baptized and received into the church that I passed through a very disturbing experience which happened when I was about 16 years of age. For some months I had been suffering from extreme melancholy. I used to pace our little garden, and as it was near a church I often heard the organ being played. The strains of the music almost drove me to despair, for they seemed charged with all the sadness and sorrow that this world and its people had ever known. This must have gone on for months, yet I do not know how I succeeded in evading going to service on Sunday evenings. Instead, I paced the garden paths, listening to the melancholy organ and feeling like a lost soul. But worse was to follow. Suddenly and without any warning I woke up, so to speak, and realized that my true identity was not this little finite personality known as H.T.H. Then I exclaimed, "Who am I, and what am I doing here?" During this distressing period I went to my parents as well as to our minister, and asked them what it all meant, but they could not help me. I sometimes think that if at that time I could have received a little help from a competent teacher, I might have been saved from much suffering and sorrow, but alas, there was no one who could help me in the slightest degree. Also, it might have helped if I had met some wise person, who could have explained to me that the personal ego was not my real self, but merely a shadow on the screen of time. If I could have been shown, as does Professor Mottram in his The Physical Basis of Personality, that the real I, or core of my being is a spark, an atom of the fundamental reality in the universe, it might have made a tremendous difference to me in my almost despairing perplexity. However, none could help me, and so the golden moment was lost. Yet gradually the great realization of my true identity died away and I became normal, as people called it. In reality, however, this normality pushed me back into my prison, and it was many a long year before I was able to realize the truth again. On thinking the matter over after a lapse of nearly 60 years, though, I must admit that there may have been another side to the question. It might have been the worst possible thing for me, at that age, to have pursued the matter of my true identity. It may have been a premature breaking out of the eternal self, and this might have proved too much for me and unhinged my mind. Truth is undoubtedly withheld from us until we are ready for it is so powerful that it would destroy us, in much the same way as if we gaze at the sun too long without protective glasses we may damage the retina of the eyes. Therefore a premature realization of the inner spiritual man might have proved equally destructive to me. The experience, however, did prove to me that it was possible to have a true cosmic experience without knowing any doctrine, or creed, or theological theories. Those around me who were full to the brim with these things had no direct cosmic experience nor knowledge of their true natures, whereas I who accepted none of these matters had the cosmic experience. Consequently I came to the conclusion that the real thing, which cannot be described, can be found only through experience, and quite apart from any doctrinal or theological theories. What knowledge I have of God, and the way to find God and to realize truth, I have found wholly apart from any doctrine or theory. This is not meant to imply that I attack these things. Indeed, I know that they are helpful to many. but I have to put on record that they have never been helpful to me. Chapter 2, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and a certain Mr. Pliable. As I grew older, I quite failed to understand my father's theology. It transpired that he was a Calvinist and therefore believed in the doctrine of predestination. Consequently, it was not easy to understand why he should pray for us children so earnestly and imploringly. If our destiny as to whether we were to be saved or lost was settled before we were born, why should it be necessary for him to pray to God to save us ere it was too late? However, I thank God that our Father did pray for us so earnestly and persistently, for we certainly needed it. But my parents' loving zeal on my behalf was not confined to long and earnest prayer. I wished at the time that it had been. Their prayers for my conversion did not worry me very much. I was quite content that they should continue to pray for me as it seemed to please them, and as far as I could see, did me no harm. But soon after our Sunday school teacher had told us that we had better get saved and flee from the wrath to come, my dear little mother started a similar campaign. The onslaught by our Sunday school teacher was not too bad for, being frightened by what he said about going to hell if we should be run over in the street. We were only too glad to agree to what he said, and really mean it at the time. But the effects soon wore off and we were not worried about the subject again. But with mother it was different. It was easy enough to give way to her gentle pleadings and really want to be a good boy, but I was not allowed to forget her concern for me. Again and again I was asked if I had given my heart to Jesus, yet when I stuck up for myself against my sister and brother, I was told that I was inconsistent. Naturally enough, I got very weary of being worried, cajoled and harried in this way. I had been very ill, I remember, when mother first began this process of direct action, instead of relying on prayer. I was extremely weak at the time, not even convalescent. Mother said that I might easily have died, but God had spared me. He might not spare me another time, therefore in order to be safe I ought to be saved. I gave in to her pleadings, but it made me very unhappy to think that God was of such a nature that we had to be saved in order to escape from his wrath. I remember, too, that Father began to deal with me in much the same way. He got me by myself and told me that he had something very serious to say to me. He said that it was time that I came to a decision. But Father was more reasonable than the others who seemed to think that I could be persuaded into being a Christian by argument and pressure. He apparently did not quite agree with that line of attack, but made me promise that I would become a seeker, and then nearly every night would ask me if I was still seeking. I am afraid though that in order to escape his attentions and so avoid awkward questions, I often told him that I was. But of course I was not. All the badgering to which I was subjected merely tired me out, and did not make me a real seeker. However, in course of time I followed in the footsteps of my brother and sister, by asking to be baptized by immersion according to the rites of the Baptist Church. After the morning service my father took me into the vestry, and told the minister that I wanted to join the church. I was very emotional at the time, so that when the minister began to question me I burst into tears. All that the dear old man asked me was, "Well, my dear boy, do you love Jesus?" I had been expecting him to question me about doctrine which might have been difficult to answer, so that when he asked the simple question, I was reduced to sobs, as I confessed that I did indeed love Jesus. I knew then that I always had done so, and that although I was a rebel against theology and doctrine, I should always love him, even though I might follow him but a very long way off. It was at a special Sunday evening service that I was baptized. I was just one of many candidates. I was conscious that the church was packed with people, especially in the gallery which permitted the best view. The platform beneath the pulpit had been removed, revealing a large pool filled with water about 3 feet deep. The service was a very impressive one, yet what hymns were sung or what the sermon was about, I cannot recollect. I do remember though that the congregation was very interested and very quiet. At last the minister went down the steps into the water. Then he called the first candidate, and so the ceremony began. When my turn came I felt strangely elated, and when I was actually immersed, was conscious of a great spiritual presence. I know that I felt very happy, peaceful and carefree. For once, everything in my life seemed to be just right. I seemed to have found my true place, and to be at the heart of an interior harmony which was the perfect expression of the divine idea. Mine had not been a happy life. My disposition was not light-hearted, and my temperament was what is called difficult. Consequently, I cannot remember ever having been really carefree. Therefore, when during my baptism I felt lifted up into a state which transcends happiness, and which can be likened only to bliss and indescribable joy, the experience was unforgettable. When I was received into the church and was allowed to take part in the communion service, I was not conscious of the presence at all. This deeply disappointed me. The joy and bliss which came to me at baptism had continued with me for a time. Then the feeling of upliftment began to wane and finally died out, like a fire in the grate which goes out because of lack of attention. Perhaps that was why the love in my heart grew cold, through lack of attention. Yet it is a fact that it does not seem possible to stay permanently on the mountain top of spiritual experience. For if there is anything in us which is unredeemed, or which needs sublimating, then we must needs go down into the valley again to meet our Apollyon. I, however, had not got as far as that. I was more like Bunyan's shallow-hearted companion, who when he fell into the slough of despond turned round and went back to the city of destruction. I responded easily and quickly to the call to the divine life, but I easily tired and soon gave up in face of the difficulties of the way. Nevertheless, God had not forgotten me, although I had so quickly grown weary of Him. It was easy to feel happy and good at a prayer meeting and to enjoy the fellowship of saints, but it was far from easy to keep my mind fixed on divine things when I was at my daily work. There the atmosphere and the language were far from heavenly indeed, they savored more of the bottomless pit. I used to wonder where all the filth and profanity came from, for such things could never find their origin in the human mind. The only explanation was that certain of my fellow students were open channels to a belching up of evil from that plane which is like a cesspit of iniquity. That such a plane exists we know from the fact that those who unfortunately become possessed, although they have never in all their life heard such evil language, will in their insanity pour out the most fearful obscenities and profanities. It is unlikely that the workshop in which I spent my working hours was either better or worse than any other similar place. Consequently, what I had to go through was typical of what every boy or young fellow, who tries to live a life according to heavenly principles, has to face. Some are strong enough to stand fast and to win through persecution and ridicule, but alas, I was not strong, but weak and yielding. My mother used to quote a text against me, "Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel." I used to start out with high hopes and in a spirit of easy optimism, but before long I would be cast down and discouraged. Then, like Mr. Pliable, would soon be back at the place from which I had started. Gradually I succumbed to the temptations of my workshop environment, and in consequence found myself living a dual life. At home I would be the highly worthy Dr. Jekyll, while in the workshop I would be the highly reprehensible Mr. Hyde, a deplorable state of affairs which could not continue indefinitely. The highly respectable Dr. Jekyll side of me was merely a sham, a mere shell of pretense, and sooner or later the shell would crack, revealing the real state of affairs within. It was not so difficult to keep up the deception while I lived with my family. Indeed, it was comparatively easy to fit into the framework of home life. Here was a set pattern to which I had been accustomed all my life. We children were expected to act with propriety, to be well behaved, to attend public worship, and so on. There were no smoking, drinking, dancing, and going to theaters. To all this I fitted in quite easily, for I never found it difficult to mold myself to my immediate environment. It was a case, with me, of being all things to all men. It just depended upon my environment at any given moment whether I was pseudo-saint or rollicking worldling. Of course, this sort of thing was very bad for me. It was baneful for my health owing to the inner conflict which was engendered. It was also detrimental to my spiritual life. The time came, however, when it was deemed advisable for me to leave home. Dr. Jekyll was sorry at the prospect, but Mr.HYDE was thrilled with the feeling that at last he was going to have the opportunity of really kicking over the traces and having a high old time. So it was with mixed feelings that I left the parental roof for the first time. It was easy to feel happy and good at a prayer meeting and to enjoy the fellowship of saints, but it was far from easy to keep my mind fixed on divine things when I was at my daily work. There the atmosphere and the language were far from heavenly indeed, they savored more of the bottomless pit. I used to wonder where all the filth and profanity came from, for such things could never find their origin in the human mind. The only explanation was that certain of my fellow students were open channels to a belching up of evil from that plane which is like a cesspit of iniquity. That such a plane exists we know from the fact that those who unfortunately become possessed, although they have never in all their life heard such evil language, will in their insanity pour out the most fearful obscenities and profanities. It is unlikely that the workshop in which I spent my working hours was either better or worse than any other similar place. Consequently, what I had to go through was typical of what every boy or young fellow who tries to live a life according to heavenly principles has to face. Some are strong enough to stand fast and to win through persecution and ridicule, but alas, I was not strong, but weak and yielding. My mother used to quote a text against me, "Unstable as water, thou shalt not excel." I used to start out with high hopes and in a spirit of easy optimism, but before long I would be cast down and discouraged. Then, like Mr. Pliable, would soon be back at the place from which I had started. Gradually I succumbed to the temptations of my workshop environment, and in consequence found myself living a dual life. At home I would be the highly worthy Dr. Jekyll, while in the workshop I would be the highly reprehensible Mr.HYDE, a deplorable state of affairs which could not continue indefinitely. The highly respectable Dr. Jekyll side of me was merely a sham, a mere shell of pretense, and sooner or later the shell would crack, revealing the real state of affairs within. It was not so difficult to keep up the deception while I lived with my family. Indeed, it was comparatively easy to fit into the framework of home life. Here was a set pattern to which I had been accustomed all my life. We children were expected to act with propriety, to be well behaved, to attend public worship, and so on. There were no smoking, drinking, dancing, and going to theaters. To all this I fitted in quite easily, for I never found it difficult to mold myself to my immediate environment. It was a case, with me, of being all things to all men. It just depended upon my environment at any given moment whether I was pseudo-saint or rollicking worldling. Of course, this sort of thing was very bad for me. It was baneful for my health owing to the inner conflict which was engendered. It was also detrimental to my spiritual life. The time came, however, when it was deemed advisable for me to leave home. Dr. Jekyll was sorry at the prospect, but Mr.HYDE was thrilled with the feeling that at last he was going to have the opportunity of really kicking over the traces and having a high old time. So it was with mixed feelings that I left the parental roof for the first time. It was an exciting, or at any rate a thrilling, experience, for it was to a small country town of some 2,000 inhabitants in Norfolk that I went in order to fill a very humble position. The little town was not much more than a large village, but it had a market square, a town hall and magistrates' court. Altogether it was tidy, clean and compact. There were also 2 public houses, an hotel, a church and a congregational chapel. The glamour of it all comes back to me as I write, but alas, I cannot express its magic. After the artificialities and monotony of life in a London suburb, to be in a real country town was an inspiring change. I was thrilled. Here indeed was life. I was near to the source of things, to the heart of nature. Who would ever live in a soulless suburb? I mused. The very thought gave me a feeling of suffocation. The congregational people soon found me out. They had received a letter from the church secretary at home, asking them to look after me. I was invited to attend church services, to join their literary and debating societies, and to engage in various other activities. This I did, and for a time Dr. Jekyll was much to the fore, but alas, there were no spiritual life and power to support him. Consequently, it was not long before Mr.HYDE began to make his presence felt. In fact, he took almost complete control of the situation. Evil thoughts were allowed to dominate my mind. The old Adam nature came to the surface, and I led a life which, so far from giving me any happiness or satisfaction, brought me great unhappiness and dissatisfaction. How easily we are misled by desire. We think that if only we can have a certain thing, that the gratification which it gives will bring us satisfaction. But instead we find that it yields us the misery of remorse, together with an increased sense of emptiness, dissatisfaction and frustration. There might have been some excuse for my wild companions. They knew no better. But in my case there could be none, for had I not had glimpses of the heavenly vision? I seemed to be like the man, spoken of by Jesus, from whom an evil spirit departed. No good spirit took the place of the evil spirit, so that when the latter returned accompanied by 7 other spirits, even more evil than itself, they were able to enter into the man, and thus was his last state worse than his first. Mine was indeed a Jekyll and Hyde life. And like the little girl in the nursery rhyme who, when she was good, was very, very good, I also in my Dr. Jekyll state lived almost an austere life, one of impressive propriety. I was quiet, well-behaved, having no love for anything worldly or unseemly. I was content to stay at home, or to attend lectures and concerts, or engage in debates, or write and read papers. Yes, like the little girl, I was very, very good, but... yes, that was the trouble. The pendulum of my life would swing too far either way, first to the right, when all was good and orderly, then to the left, when all was evil and disorderly. Like the man in the parable, the evil spirit would leave me for a season, and my life would be all that could be desired. Then after a time it would return, accompanied by a number of other evil spirits, so that my last state was worse than the first. Looking back, I can now see that God was leading and guiding me even in those days. He was giving me enough rope to enable me to learn through bitter experience, sorrow and suffering, the great lesson that of ourselves we can do nothing. Yet it did not seem much like divine guidance then. Rather it seemed that I was being impelled by 100 devils. In my lucid moments I pondered deeply over the situation, and it became obvious, not only to myself, but to everyone who knew me, that I was deteriorating. Also I was becoming careless in my work as well as in other things. Friends said that if I left the town, thus breaking away from the wild set which they believed was the cause of my weakness, I might turn over a new leaf and settle down to a normal life. So that is what I did. I left the town and went to the Midlands, where things were as different as they could be: the people, the way of living, my working conditions. In a word, it was a complete change. I started off with renewed hopes for the future, and for a time did well, but before long the old story was repeated, and in each case the last state of that man was worse than the first. So again I left for another place in order to make a fresh start, yet again the same thing was repeated. It was at this time that I began to suffer from bouts of terrible remorse, and periods of black despair. A very fine young man did his best to reclaim me, and pleaded with me to join in with him to live the religious life. He was about to become an Anglo-Catholic priest and urged me to follow his example. He said that transubstantiation was the great secret, and that he had known men of grossly immoral characters who had become completely changed and master of themselves and their passions, simply through believing in and practicing transubstantiation. I was attracted, but not convinced. I was attracted more by this line of thought than I was by my father's hard and harsh doctrines, but I did not feel ready to live the religious life as this good man lived it. I was much affected by his love for me and his anxiety for my welfare, but I refused his outstretched hand. And so we parted. What became of him I never knew. He was a fine fellow, a true fisher of men, and I send him my love. That is one of the lovely things about the inner life: we can send love to all men wherever in God's universe they may be. So now at this moment I send my friend my love, and at this moment he receives it. So my solicitous friend, looking very troubled, left me while I continued my self-willed and devil-possessed way, feeling distinctly unhappy and uneasy. But the feeling wore off after a time, and once again I was following too much the devices and desires of my own heart. It was about this time that I suffered much from remorse and was filled with the anguish of the lost, those who have lost their way. My affairs too were in a desperate and unhappy condition. So I decided to return home, for I came to the conclusion that there, I would be able to live the kind of life that would be expected of me. I felt that the discipline of my parents' rather austere way of living would be beneficial, and that I would be able to forget the past and thus make a fresh start in life. At this point in my story it may be asked, but what about your search for reality? My reply is that I cannot remember making any conscious search for ultimate truth at all, so that my search, if such it could be called, was quite unconscious on my part. I was searching by not searching, so to speak. Because I was seeking for satisfaction where it could not be found, in excesses, in sensation, in the things of this world and the flesh, it does not follow that I was not seeking God. There was something within me which responded to the drawing power of God, who is love, but the trouble was that I sought satisfaction in the wrong things, in the broken cisterns of the world and the flesh, instead of in the living fountains which can never fail. We may possess great powers and possibilities, yet if our lower nature is not redeemed or sublimated, these powers and possibilities may find expression in unregenerate forms. It would seem that in the case of some of us, these powers become awakened before we are ready for such a thing to happen. My good Anglo-Catholic friend said that he could see great possibilities in me, and that if only they could be harnessed to the right cause, or be sublimated, then my life would become a channel of considerable blessing. But how to bring about this change he did not know, neither did I. It is, I think, a true saying that a great sinner, if thoroughly converted, can become a great saint. I have been a great sinner, indeed. At times I have confessed to God that I was the greatest of sinners, and I meant it. Consequently I ought to by now to have become a great saint, but, alas, I see no signs. But I can say that I loathe the things which I once loved, and that my only ambition now is to follow him who has blazed the trail and trodden the path that we all must tread. It gives me a thrill to think that we are all traveling along the same path, the path the saints have trod. We are all one brotherhood, one fellowship of saints, and this includes the weakest and humblest among us. We belong to that company among which none wants to be ministered to but only to minister, and to be looked upon as the least of all. When the disciples argued as to which should be greatest in the kingdom of heaven, they showed that they were not ready for the kingdom. For those who are heavenly minded have no desire for preferment, they are content to take the lowest seat at the table. Adopting for a moment the conventional idea of heaven as a walled city with a gate in it, presided over by St. Peter, I love to imagine myself, if ever I get thus far, as slipping in unobserved while St. Peter is engaged in attending to some matter of importance, and then hiding myself in a corner where no one would notice me, where I could join in the singing and praise, pouring out my heart in gratitude and love to my Lord. I decided therefore to wind up my affairs and to leave the town. This was a sad business, for I had some good friends who had stood by me through thick and thin. They knew that I was almost penniless, yet one gave me a shilling, which was all he possessed. Another had no money but insisted on my accepting a wonderful walking stick which he had made. This was his greatest pride and pleasure, so I accepted it because of the love which lay behind it. And so it went on. We were a small group, all victims of human frailties, but all good friends, always willing to share what we had, and to trust the morrow to provide for its own necessities. Thus came to an end the first phase of my pilgrimage, or, as some might prefer to term it, my career as a modern prodigal son. I was at this time less than 23 years old and had been away from home about 4 years, yet I had worked in no fewer than 3 different places. So I had nothing about which to boast, for I had achieved nothing. I was a complete failure, a ne'er-do-well, or, as my brother described me, a messer. However, God was leading me, and He can teach us more through our failures than through our successes. As I look back on those far-off days, my heart is filled with devout thankfulness and gratitude to God for exercising a restraining influence upon my life. I almost went to the devil, but not quite. It was the love of God which saved me from complete self-destruction. Although always on the brink, love kept me from falling over. Chapter 3: Broken Cisterns. For my people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewed them out of cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water. Jeremiah 2:13. When I returned to my parents' house, I did not go as did the prodigal son. I just returned home, neither expressing sorrow nor explaining my shabby appearance and penniless state. Yet I met with no reproaches. I was accepted and made welcome. How great indeed is the love of some parents! It was in a chastened mood, however, that I resumed my place in the family circle, but I doubt whether there was any real change of heart. That is to say, the atavistic and irresponsible elements in my makeup remained unsubdued. They were still there, lying dormant, ready to come to the surface whenever opportunity offered. I desired as ardently as ever to live a blameless life, and I believe I also longed to follow the religious life, but my experience was like that of St. Paul: for the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. It was soon after I returned home that the presence, which was with me at the time of my baptism, came to me again. Elsewhere I have described this experience as follows: one night I felt that I must pray, so I knelt down by the side of my bed. Immediately I became aware of the divine presence. I felt that God was near and that His presence filled the room. This presence was real and tangible. It was warm and glowing. It was not merely a state of mind or consciousness. It was something more than that. It was as though the Lord Himself had come into the room and had come very close to me, and that I had entered into His aura, or whatever we may call the spiritual atmosphere which surrounds Him and which is emitted from Him. It is not possible to describe such an experience. All care, anxiety, and fear vanished, and I felt that I was cradled in divine love, and poised in it and in the eternal, effortlessly, just as the heavenly bodies are poised, effortlessly, in space. The deep peace of the eternal flowed through me like a river, yet at the same time it was as though I was being carried along on a stream of divine bliss, and that the Lord and I were unified and had become one in union forever. There was I, cradled in love, immersed in God's inward peace, and floating out onto the bosom of an infinite ocean of infinite bliss, yet, at the same time, His peace and His bliss flowed through me like a great river, and I was one with it, while, paradoxically, it seemed that I was the river itself. But just as Peter and James and John were not allowed to remain on the Mount of Transfiguration, so it was with me. The night of blessed revealing came to an end, the blissful sense of the near presence departed, the realization of union was lost, and the vivid experience faded into a memory. Time passed, and I became so immersed in the material life that it took a series of sharp shocks and considerable upheavals in order to reduce me to that dependent and receptive attitude without which it is impossible for any revealings to be made. In times of great sorrow and loss, or in times of great strain and stress, crisis and difficulty, the presence has come to me as He did in my early years. Also, at other times, when a great blessing has been approaching, I have become filled with a great peace and sense of heavenly joy. In fact, that is the way in which one can be guided and forewarned. If what we call an evil experience is approaching, then a dark and chill cloud descends upon us, destroying all sense of God's presence. If, on the other hand, what we call a good experience is approaching, then we become encompassed about with light and radiance, and filled with joy and bliss. How wonderful is the love of God, and how gracious the Lord is. To think that I should be favored with such an experience after all my wildness and transgression. One would have thought that after such a gracious experience I would never have fallen away again. Yet its effect wore off after a time, and in spite of the veneer of the Dr. Jekyll appearance of piety, Mr.HYDE's propensities were as active as ever. I lived at home for 4 or 5 years, and built up a business out of nothing and without any capital. Then I had a long and serious illness from which I did not recover entirely. So I turned the business over to my brother, and once more left home, to seek health and fortune elsewhere. Fate took me to the eastern counties where at a seaside resort I made many friends. It was during this period that I got married to the lady to whom I was engaged, and for a time we lived on the Norfolk coast, sharing a cottage with a farm worker and his wife, a most delightful couple. It was, however, before my marriage that an incident occurred which seemed to shew that God wanted to make use of me, in spite of my many lapses and irresponsibilities. It happened in this way. One Saturday evening the assistant congregational minister called on me and made a strange request. He asked me if I would deputize for him the following morning at their church about 2 miles away, as the senior minister had been taken ill suddenly, so that the assistant would have to preach at the parent church. At last, after much persuasion, I consented, but on condition that my friend, the Y.M.C. secretary, should go with me and give me his moral support as well as help to conduct the service. By this time it was late evening and I had work to do, so I had no time in which to prepare a sermon. Never had I felt more miserable and helpless than I did when going to church the following morning. I had neither sermon, nor text, nor had I even a reading or hymn chosen. I felt like a man must feel when going to his execution. Indeed, while my friend opened the service by giving out a hymn, I would gladly have died if only I could have escaped the coming ordeal. I wished devoutly that I could have sunk through the floor, never to be seen or heard of again. But it was not to be. Inexorably the service proceeded, each minute bringing me nearer my doom. In vain I looked through my Bible for a portion to read, but being in a state of panic my mind could not concentrate on anything. Then all at once, when I was in the deepest despair and feeling really desperate, I began to read, apparently quite by chance, part of John 2:15-17. Love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. And the world passeth away, and the lust thereof, but he that doeth the will of God abideth forever. At once, in the twinkling of an eye, the burden was lifted from me, and with it the darkness and fear. For a time, at any rate, I entered into the glorious liberty of the children of God. I was filled with joy and peace, for once again the presence had visited me. The service proceeded, but I felt no more fear or dread. Even my friend's strained whisper, telling me not to forget the special prayer of thanksgiving, failed to upset me. I led the congregation in a prayer of thanksgiving quite extempore, and as I prayed we all seemed to be lifted up into the bosom of God. This was a good preparation for the sermon, yet even now I did not know what I was going to say, but I felt intuitively that God had given me the right text, and that He would also tell me what to say about it. And so it proved. For as I read out the 3 verses, I entered into a larger consciousness, and saw all life and humanity spread out before me. I saw men lusting and striving, grabbing and scrambling, clutching eagerly at the baubles of life yet failing to hold them, and then being caught in eddies which drew them down out of sight. For a short time I seemed to have cosmic vision. I seemed to be standing on a mountain top looking down at a sea of faces, with a feeling of intense pity in my heart. What shall it profit a man, if he gain the whole world of worthless baubles, and lose his own soul? Everything was spread out before me. I seemed to see into the hearts of struggling men and women, their hopes and fears, their desires and frailties, the hopelessness of all their strivings. Love not the world. For the world passeth away, and the lust thereof. And as I spoke, tears came to my eyes. The whole dreadful tragedy was so clear to me, and, so it seemed, to the congregation also. And then came the positive promise contained in the text, but he that doeth the will of God, abideth forever. Yes, that was all that we had to do the will of our Father, God, not to believe in any doctrine which might affront our intelligence or sense of justice, but just to do the will of God. If we do so we abide forever, for the will of God is the divine order which never changes or grows old. When I had said all that the presence wanted me to say, I left off, and the service soon after came to a close. When I look back on this incident, it seems to me that it was one of the greatest experiences of my life. For a brief space I was really in the Spirit on the Lord's day, and like the apostles I was given not only power, but prophetic insight. What is amazing and past all human understanding, or so it seems to me, is that God should have chosen one so frail and unworthy to be His channel. Yet it would seem that it pleases God to do this sort of thing. Looking back over the years, I see another thing very clearly. It was when I was at my extremity and in an agony of helplessness, when I realized that of myself I could do nothing. It was then, and not before, that the Spirit came to me and lifted the burden and set me free. Perhaps this is the explanation of the mystery. It probably is in my particular case, for every great enlightenment which has come to me since that experience, has come when I have been in a state of dire extremity. It is probable that I am one of those who can learn the deep truths of life only through bitter experience and frustration. When one has learnt one's lesson in this way, it is well learnt, so that one is inclined to think that there is no other way. I am quite content to have come the difficult way, but nevertheless I believe that God has a better way, for the way of the Spirit is harmony and peace. However, I can only describe the way that I myself have come, and tell of that which I have learnt through practical experience. Now it was after we were married that I became acquainted with a gentleman holding a high position in a nearby town, and who was very much respected. In appearance he looked particularly healthy. Although elderly, he had what is sometimes called a schoolgirl complexion. His eyes were bright and he possessed remarkable powers of endurance. He used to rise at 4 o'clock every morning, and in spring and summer would walk about 8 miles before going to business. He lived on 2 meals a day, which at that time consisted of fruit and nuts. Later he added cereals, but not pulses. His drink was water. Anyhow, this remarkable man aroused my interest, for I could do none of the things which he was able to do so easily, in spite of the fact that I was only half his age. For instance, if I had been able to walk 8 miles before breakfast, I should have been tired out for the rest of the day. Yet this elderly man did it easily and without fatigue. Also, he beat me easily at mental work requiring close concentration, and he accomplished it without fatigue. If I attempted similar feats, I became exhausted. It was natural then that I should want to know how he did it. What was his secret? He explained that we could control ourselves and our lives entirely by diet. If we were ill, we could cure ourselves by fasting. If we were too stout or too thin, we could regulate our weight simply by being selective in our diet. Everything, he said, was in our own hands. My friend also lent me some books, one of which was Fasting and the No Breakfast Plan. I read this with avidity, thinking that at last I had found the great secret of life. Then I came across other books which made even more remarkable claims. These told me that I could become quite heavenly and godlike if only I would eat pure food. They assured me that if I would but do this, I should have pure blood, and then because of the purity of the blood which flowed through the capillaries of my brain, I should think pure thoughts, after which would follow pure actions, and so on to sainthood. They also declared that disease would cease, and that we should all live to a great age. Look at the elephant, exhorted the pundits, and be wise. He eats only vegetable food and lives to be 100, whereas the dog who lives on flesh dies after a few years. I must have been very gullible, for I swallowed everything that the book stated, and really believed it. But more, I insisted upon everyone else believing in it also, and so I deluged my friends and relations with a stream of propagandist literature, booklets, magazines, pamphlets and leaflets, becoming a thoroughgoing crank and a general nuisance to everyone who knew me. When I started telling everyone the glad new gospel, that everything on this earth was to be put right quite easily through a change of diet, I expected that they would accept it as eagerly as I had done. But I was doomed to disappointment, for not one of them did so. This not only disappointed me, but filled me with anger. The weakness of my case lay in the fact that I did not look healthy, neither did I feel well. I therefore decided that I must make myself fit, then perhaps they would listen to me. As usual, I went to extremes. I fasted and followed all the food fads that I knew of, but all in vain. About this time my wife and I left East Anglia and went back to London. There I carried on my propaganda, and with my fastings and freak diets. I was so enthusiastic that the minister of our church asked me to give a lecture. This gave me a new idea, and I could see a new channel of propaganda opening up before me, so I readily accepted the offer. The meeting was a great success, so much so that before long I found myself fulfilling many engagements. In spite of all my efforts, however, I did not look well, whilst I suffered frequently from heavy colds. It was about this time that I discovered in a little newsagent's window a copy of McFadden's Physical Culture magazine. I bought a copy at once and perused it eagerly. What struck me most was the fact that McFadden recommended 2 meals a day of fruit and nuts besides, of course, outlining all sorts of exercises. I used to get up early in order to do exercises, bathe, and also go for walks, but I tired myself out and became excessively thin. Still I persevered. I sought to become a picture of health, poised and cheerful, but alas, I was none of these. I was irritable, suffered from bad colds, and my weight fell from about 12 stone to 9 stone 6 pounds. However, it was not my physical condition which was my principal disappointment. I found through bitter experience that all the assertions made about the eating of non-flesh foods automatically translating people into saints and gods was pure moonshine. Believing what I had been told and what I had read, I had incorporated these assumptions into my lectures. Consequently, I passed on to others irresponsible and unsubstantiated advice. And because I misled people in these matters, it became necessary that I should learn and prove through bitter experience the absolute falsity of the statements I had made. There was not a single claim which I had made which was not to be demonstrated, in my life and experience, as completely false. I remember now that I was warned by a wise and good man about this very thing. At his invitation I lectured at his Baptist church. The lecture was well attended and passed off successfully. A few days afterwards the minister called and stayed to tea. In the course of conversation he told me, apropos my lecture, that he felt that I was putting the cart before the horse, and that what I was teaching was an inversion of truth. He further remarked that if he had been giving the lecture, he would have emphasized the fact that first of all we must change our thoughts, after which right action and the adoption of a right diet would follow. Of course I could not agree with him, and when he left he may have thought that he had failed in his argument, yet his visit was not in vain. Everything that the minister said was to be proved true in my own life, and I remember him with deep affection. Time passed, and my enthusiasm both for extreme dieting, fasting, and physical culture began to wane. For one thing, I could not demonstrate any good results in my own life and affairs, and I also found that there were others who, following the same cults, were as unfruitful as myself. As I look back, I am appalled at my denseness, but evidently it was a necessary phase through which I had to pass before commencing the next stage. I had to learn to put first things first, and not to attempt to improve the soul through the body, but rather the body through the soul. We come to this plane in order to learn certain lessons, as well as to accomplish some special work or act of service. What few things my life's experiences have taught have had to be learned through blood and tears, but they will never have to be learned again. What I have learned has been woven into the very texture of my being and can never be obliterated. All that I have been through seems to have been necessary, and looking back, even upon my greatest losses and sorrows, I would not now have had it otherwise. With regard to a non-flesh diet, I continued with this for 8 years, then when I became successful in business in 1909 I abandoned it. I kept to a mixed dietary until after the First World War, and in 1919 again took to a non-flesh diet, and have continued with it ever since. I am not spiritually minded because I am a vegetarian, but I am a vegetarian because I strive to be spiritually minded. As one advances in spiritual understanding, flesh eating becomes repugnant and one is happier without it, at least, that has been my experience. As to physical culture and body worship, at the time of writing this I am nearly 80 years of age and obviously have no ambitions in that direction. I do no physical exercises but ride my old bicycle still, and lead an active life. This is sufficient, I think, for a septuagenarian. But let the young follow physical culture if it is attractive to them, yet let them not overdo it. And let them remember to put soul and spirit first. Chapter 4, New Ideas. It was round about the year 1904 that I came in contact with what is generally known as New Thought. This was a great revelation at the time, and although the few books which came my way were diffuse and rather vague, they contained much information which was quite new to me. I learned for the first time something about the nature and power of thought, of the evil effects of negative thinking, and the beneficial effects of positive thinking. I also read of the destructive effects of evil emotions, such as anger, lust, envy, resentment, hatred, and so on. All this came as a great shock to me, for I realized that I had been in the habit of wallowing in a sea of wrong and even evil thoughts. What a fool I had been! No wonder I had met with so much trouble and difficulty. But my reading also brought me a glimmer of light. Instead of hoping that in some distant future, as a result of abstaining from flesh foods, I might become capable of thinking pure thoughts, I began to see dimly that it might be possible for me to train my mind to think good thoughts to the exclusion of evil ones. I therefore determined to become a right thinker, which sounded simple enough. Also, I could see that prayer was an attempt at right thinking, and it was obvious to me that in order to pray one had to concentrate one's thoughts upon God. As God is the very quintessence of goodness and truth, then prayer, if it succeeds in staying the mind upon God, must be the highest form of right thinking. All my life I had been puzzled by the various doctrines and theological theories propounded by the various churches, but now I was led to see that all such speculations had only one purpose: to focus one's thoughts upon God. It all seemed as simple as that, but little did I know what lay before me. However, God always leads us a step at a time. We do not know where we are going, nor how we are being led, but God does, for His ways are perfect and His dealings with us past all human understanding. And so I determined to become a right thinker. But was it easy, as well as simple? Indeed, it was not, for I found that I had very little power of concentration. My thoughts persisted in wandering all over the universe and into past and future, instead of remaining one-pointed on the idea or subject upon which I wished to fix my mind. I also found myself thinking wrong thoughts almost always, so that it was only by a special effort that I could break away from my accustomed habit of mind, yet after a minute or two I was indulging in my usual practice of thinking thoughts of a wrong kind. With me it was not a case of thinking rightly as a general rule, only occasionally lapsing into wrong thinking and suffering for it accordingly. No, it was just the opposite of this. I discovered that I was an habitual wrong thinker, that I had been one all my life, and that I lived in a veritable sea of wrong thoughts. It was only occasionally and by great effort that I could brace myself up sufficiently to think a few positive and constructive thoughts. Another great drawback was that I possessed no substratum of truth. It therefore seemed to me that everything depended upon my right thinking, and that if I wanted good to appear in my life, then I must create it by my own efforts. I was seeking and chasing after good, but in spite of all my efforts it always eluded me. Little did I realize that the truth of the matter was the exact opposite, that actually good wanted me and was seeking me, striving to help me and fill my life with all manner of harmony. I did not know then that what was needed was not to create good, but rather to remove my inhibitions, thus allowing the ever-present good to enter and manifest itself. I also fell into the error of thinking that I had to avoid all unpleasant thoughts and think only pleasant ones. The result of this was disastrous, for my natural weakness of being unable to make a decision was greatly increased. Now a man of indecision is one who will not face up to facts. If in addition he will not face up to his thoughts, avoiding all unpleasant ones, his case is then indeed a serious one. What I was trying to practice was not right thinking, but really a form of wrong thinking, for as soon as an unpleasant thought came into my mind, such as, let us say, a picture of limitation of some kind, I would dismiss it and think of something pleasant. This is correct enough if the thought is one of temptation to do evil, but it is wrong to dismiss it if it is a thought of some unpleasant duty to be performed, or some crisis which has to be met. Such a practice is the equivalent of daydreaming, one of the most destructive of all mental habits. It is tantamount to the action of a man who is in debt and whose business does not pay, going out for the evening and getting drunk in order to forget his worries. By such an action he reduces his own efficiency and wastes valuable capital, whilst after it is over he has to face the same old troubles, less equipped than ever to do so. My fundamental and most serious mistake was in demanding money, power, and worldly success from the infinite, for this was done with the idea of getting something for nothing, which of course is impossible. We can only get something for something. Notwithstanding all popular ideas to the contrary, we have to pay the price for everything that we demand from life. But being galled by the respectable poverty in which I had been brought up, I greatly desired to get out of the rut and join the ranks of what are termed the privileged classes. Consequently, when I read about the power of mind and thought, and how one could alter one's circumstances by making demands upon the infinite, I jumped at the idea. I was greatly in need of money at the time, having several businesses, but without sufficient capital to work them properly. So every night after dark I went into the garden and, standing by a clothesline post, I made vehement demands upon the infinite that a certain large sum should be taken weekly at each business. I continued this for some weeks, perhaps months, but as there seemed to be no answer to my demands, I gave up the practice. Today, I know two things which I did not know then. The first is that if we make strong demands on the invisible, something, which may not necessarily be the all-good, will answer. In our selfish demands for worldly wealth and fame we may be addressing ourselves not to God, but to the prince of this world. If we are to become united with God, then we must be pure and unselfish in motive and, instead of demanding that our will should be done and our desires satisfied, we should seek that the will of the all-wise, all-loving, and all-good should be done instead. The second thing which I did not know was that it takes time for matters to work out, and that if our demands are big, then there may have to be big upheavals so as to make way for the new order of things. As I have said, I made my demands over a period of time and then forgot all about them, becoming engrossed in material things. But the invisible powers which I had set in motion did not forget. Indeed, I found myself thrown and tossed about by circumstances and involved in almost cataclysmic upheavals for some 3 years, and then, in 1910, I found myself established in a very profitable business in the West End of London. More than once during the times of change and upheaval through which I had to pass, I seemed to be brought to the brink of ruin, but when all seemed lost, a fresh opportunity would open up in quite a miraculous way. My friends talked much about my astounding luck. No matter what you do or what happens, they said, you always fall on your feet. This was very true. I always fell on my feet. My competitors were also amazed at my good fortune. There seemed to be a power behind me, pushing me forward. There seemed to be an influence at work which made many people go out of their way to bring me still more business. Influential people took me up for no reason that I could see. As my competitors said, my luck was phenomenal. Today I can only attribute the rapid change for the better in my circumstances to the strong demands that I had previously made upon the invisible. True, it took about 3 years to manifest, but I did not realize that before they could be met, I should have to be transplanted from a thrifty neighborhood to a well-to-do district, a process which was extremely painful because I regarded the upheavals as evil, instead of recognizing them as necessary if my demands were to be met. Something which happened about this time must be recorded. This is how I have described the experience elsewhere. It was at the end of a fairly successful day. I was rather weary and leaned back in my revolving office chair and looked at a large window facing westwards. I had just had the window partly covered with leaded stained glass, of a chlorophyll color. It was still September and the setting sun shone full on my window and, of course, through the chlorophyll glass, onto me. Light, when filtered through chlorophyll glass, is always restful to me, but on this occasion something really happened, something which could not be attributed to chlorophyll filters. It seemed that I was leaning back not on a swing chair, but on the sustaining infinite. At last, after years of wandering and struggle, I seemed perfectly comfortable, perfectly fitted into my environment, perfectly at one with the pattern of life and with the all-pervading essence which upholds the whole universe, in a state of order and perfection. For a brief space, I knew myself to be a true child of the Eternal, and one with the Changeless One. There was no emotion, no rapture, no ecstasy, but only a sense of great comfort and certainty. There was an entire absence of fear. I was in my right place in the cosmic whole, and I knew that I always had been and always would be. This experience lasted only a minute or two, or perhaps 5 at the utmost, but it made a great impression on me. I interpreted it to mean that good fortune was coming to me, and if phenomenal business success can be termed good fortune, then I was correct in my interpretation. Looking back over 40 years to the time when this glimpse of reality was vouchsafed to me, I marvel at my density and lack of discernment. To interpret a spiritual experience, such as many of the saints might have envied, as being merely a sign of good fortune was surely the very acme of obtuseness. I must have been so obsessed at the time with the idea of making a success of my business venture, that I could interpret nothing in terms of heavenly wisdom, but only in terms of material gain. I had forgotten the wise words of Jesus, "What shall it profit a man if he gain the whole world and lose his own soul?" Either I did not know, or else I had forgotten that the most precious of all was to know God, really and truly, and to enter into peace, and for His peace to flow through me like river. But what had brought about my extraordinary change of fortune? Some said it was through black magic, but I would rather term what I practiced as prayer wrongly applied. In the parable of the importunate widow, Jesus seems to have given His sanction to prayer, which consisted of asking for a thing until one obtained it, no matter how often one were refused. This, of course, is the lowest type of prayer, but Jesus seemed to have thought it legitimate, and my demands upon the infinite were prayers of this nature. The great mistake which I made was in demanding the wrong things. Instead of seeking the best things, I demanded the things of this world, material success, money and fame. Some power answered my prayer, whether it was God or some astral power, I do not know. But answered it was. And because I had demanded the wrong things, I became successful, but at the price of health and happiness. Aldous Huxley, in his book, The Perennial Philosophy, says that one-pointed concentration may become a dangerous form of idolatry, and mentions that in a letter to Booker, Darwin wrote, "It is a cursed evil to any man to become so absorbed in any subject as I am in mine." Aldous Huxley adds, "It is an evil because such one-pointedness may result in the more or less atrophy of all but one side of the mind." I too found it to be a cursed evil, for other sides of my mind atrophied so that I could no longer find enjoyment in the simple things of nature. My finer sensibilities were numbed and blunted. I had gained much, but the price I had to pay was indeed a heavy one. Of course, I was not happy. It was impossible that I should have been happy, seeing that I had made an entirely false start. I had chosen the wrong path, so that the more advanced the farther I departed from the divine pattern of my life. I admit that there are thousands of people who, rising from humble beginnings, become successful in life and enjoy being amongst what today are called the privileged classes. They make good use of their money and apparently have no misgivings. Indeed, they fill their new positions with dignity and earn the respect of their fellows. But in their case, they have simply followed the pattern of their life, some are born to fame and fortune, and if they follow the pattern of their life, nothing more is asked of them. But I was not one of these, for the divine pattern of my life was quite different. Therefore, when I found myself at the head of a large business, with the ball of life at my feet, I was unhappy and dissatisfied. When I had won the kind of success for which many would give their very soul to achieve, I was of all men the most unhappy. I who at one time had found consolation in nature, and who loved nature's ways, now found myself unable to enjoy them when I had the opportunity. Also, I had lost all sense of God's presence. I was shut off from nature and from God. Of course, everything has been overruled for good in the infinite wisdom and love of God. But how much needless suffering would have been avoided, if only I had made a right choice. At least, that is how it seems to me now. What I marvel at is the wonderful way in which God brought me back in spite of all my wrongdoing. Having worked against the divine pattern of my life for so long, it seemed at the time that I was completely estranged from God and hopeless, why lost. God, however, brought me back, but this could be accomplished only through suffering. Of course, God did not want me to suffer, it was I through my wrong mode of life who was the sole cause of it. There is one other matter which must be mentioned before I close this chapter. It has been described elsewhere as follows: when I was in full swing, building up my business, with my mind fully given to the task, with never a thought at that time for higher things, I had a series of night experiences which finally drove me out of business altogether. In the middle of the night I would be awakened by a feeling of actual hell. I do not use this word as a figure of speech, but in its literal sense. I felt that I was in the place of the damned. It seemed that I looked back over a past which covered all the history of man, and contained all the hopeless despair of the damned of all ages. And the lamentations of all the damned and their hopeless despair seemed to be concentrated in my own soul. I shuddered as I looked over the past. I shuddered as I looked to the future. All the sorrow, the despair, the hopelessness of a lost humanity seemed to be included in me. I felt indeed that I was in the bottomless pit. I find it quite impossible to describe these experiences, for I have no words or gift of speech with which to describe them. I can only say that they were indescribably awful. After an experience was ended, I would go to sleep again, and, when the morning came, try to forget it. Each experience shook me, but I still went on, becoming even more immersed in business. Business, that is, starting with practically nothing and working upwards against almost overwhelming difficulties, was such an engrossing sport that it was possible to forget even these solemn warnings. So that before very long I was as bad as ever, all my thoughts being set on business and material things, with never a thought for better things. These warnings persisted until I decided to get out of business. Then they ceased. I had not been going God's way, so the warnings were sent to make me turn round and live an entirely different kind of life. How blind I was! How slow I was to wake up to the fact that God's purpose was that I should engage in my present work. Alas, due entirely to my self-will and obtuseness, I was to wander for another 6 years, in the far country before I returned to my father's home. Chapter 5. I retire from business. Early in 1914 I retired from business, and we went to live in the country. I felt that if I could only get away from my business associates, and from all the exactions of business and live amongst flowers and birds, then I would be happy. It was a relief to get away from London, but while my unhappiness was lessened, I still could not say that I was at peace. No one can be made really happy through a change of environment. Happiness, as we all know, can come only from within. All the same, I must confess that I would not live in a town for a king's ransom. Yet although I can feel at home only in the country and beside the sea, these of themselves can never give real happiness. But when I escaped from London, it was probably more of a relief than it would have been to most people, for I had grown psychologically ill through becoming successful in a career for which I was not intended. The Spirit wanted me to go one way, whereas I had been lured by ambition to go another. Therefore there was a constant state of conflict, an inner warfare which was prejudicial to health. Also, when I decided to give up my business career, the night terrors ceased, thus proving that they had been warnings of great evils to come if I persisted in following a worldly career. Consequently, although I could not say that I was happy, yet I experienced considerable relief as a result of my retirement. It was in May 1914 that we settled into our country home. Then in August the First World War broke out, and in due course the countryside became denuded of its men, and finally in 1916 I myself went off to the war. Joining up as a private in the mechanical transport, I finished up as officer in charge of a technical branch of the Royal Air Force. This experience, although possessing some interest to me, has little to do with the story of my pilgrimage, so I will say nothing about it. Yet I must mention one incident which happened during this period, for it was a deep and searching experience and had much to do with my retirement from the world altogether in order to devote all my energies to my present work. My wife and I were very devoted to our second son, who was about 10 years of age and away at a public school. He was taken ill and we were sent for. Everything possible was done for him, but, to our great grief, he passed away on the anniversary of our wedding day, March 27, 1918. This was a heavy blow to us both, and it seemed to me as though the bottom of my life had fallen away. But the loss inspired in me a great sympathy for all who were bereaved and in trouble, and made me desire to do something to help mankind. I felt that I wanted to take part in some altruistic work and to engage no more in business and money-making. So after the war was over, I bought an army hut, erected it in the garden, engaged a secretary and began to write, for I felt bursting to express myself. Thus, after many vicissitudes within you as the power was produced. When I started I had no idea of writing such a book. Apparently I wrote haphazardly, putting down just whatever came into my head at the time. I planned nothing, yet in spite of this, I think that I must have been guided in my writing, for this little book has been translated into several languages and, at a rough estimate, probably something like 200,000 copies have been sold. I did not know then that I was simply reviving the teaching of Jesus, who, when he began to preach, said, according to modern translators, change your minds, and consequently your thinking, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Then later on he said that the kingdom of God is not here or there, but is within us, or as some translate it, inside us. Of course my writing was not automatic, it was ordinary conscious writing. First the idea would come into my mind, then the words with which to clothe the idea. Although at the time I commenced writing I was not conscious of being led by the Spirit yet, upon looking back over more than a quarter of a century, I can see very clearly now that it was divine guidance which led me to write such books as Within You is the Power, and Look Within. How wonderfully I was led to choose, in my ignorance, such titles for my books. Yes, it is indeed wonderful the way we are led by a higher wisdom to do just the right thing, and to make a right choice, in spite of the fact that at the time we are ignorant of the deeper implications which lie behind what we do, or say, or write. About this same time, too, I wrote a series of articles for an American magazine. These I republished in book form under the title, The Message of a Flower. I also contributed another series of articles entitled The Art of Living to the same magazine, and these were also afterwards reproduced in book form. Another book of mine about this time was The Power of Thought. Although only an amateur writer and quite ignorant of publishing, I managed to sell my books, and have continued to do so ever since, but it is not a course of action which I would recommend to everyone. This literary excursion of mine was a help to me in my own search for truth. We are told that the best way to learn is to teach, and this I found to be true, for trying to express oneself in writing helps to clarify one's thoughts and ideas. It was in April 1920 that I began the work which is known as Science of Thought. In 1921 I decided to publish a monthly magazine, the first number appearing in October. It was an immediate success. Yet needless to say I had many difficulties to overcome, as well as innumerable struggles, but there is no need to tell of them here. Suffice it to say that my new work was a success and, judging by the letters I received, was helpful to many. Again I was on top of things, just as I had been in business. But fortunately God did not allow me to stay there, for the position I was in was similar to that of a popular preacher. Thousands of people hung upon my every word, and we all know what a dangerous position that is for anyone to be in. God is too wise and too kind to allow that sort of thing to continue. Indeed, how true it is that he putteth down the mighty from their seats, and exalteth them of low degree. I too had to go through the humbling process, but of this, more anon. Going back a little in my story, it was before I began writing that I got mixed up with the I am and I am it affirmation type of teaching. I obtained some books on what is called mental science, not divine science, which is a different teaching. These told me to deny evil, poverty, disease, sickness, and even sin and death. As I am always willing to try anything once, I repeated these denials in deadly earnest, but the result was far from satisfactory, for I soon began to feel really ill. And so I continued to follow many lines of thought, but they all ended in failure. However, I gained a certain amount of understanding through such experiments, but fortunately I did not try any tricks with my breathing, otherwise I might not have escaped so lightly. In course of time I began to understand what I really wanted. What I was seeking was not anything of this world, but only to know God and experience His peace. What I yearned to do was to be able to get clear of all human strain, anxiety, and the pressure of circumstance so that I could enjoy true liberation. I wanted to enter into the glorious liberty of the children of God. Consequently, I could never be satisfied with the various teachings which I sampled, for they seemed to aim only at human good. Nobody seemed to be interested in the path of liberation. Those whom I met wanted what they called demonstrations. They wanted tangible results and had no desire to get away from the self, or the things which bind one to earth. They did not realize that attachment to things implied attachment to earth, and that all indulgence in sensation could bring only suffering in its train. In those days, I used to pace to and fro beneath the stars, repeating a text or poem which spoke to my condition, as the Quakers would say. Something disturbing might happen which would draw down upon me an avalanche of fears which threatened to sweep me off my feet, so I would try to overcome them and to reach a certain measure of peace before retiring to rest. Each time that I overcame in this way made it easier for me to overcome the next time I was assailed. And so through experience I found out how to overcome waves of fear, apprehension, and strain. I discovered, again through experience, that if I concentrated upon a text, or poem, or psalm, and kept on repeating it perseveringly, the fear would be overcome and the strain relieved. This was a valuable discovery. Previously I thought that to say a few prayers would be sufficient, but experience taught me that in my case, to do so was useless. What I found to be needed was intense concentration, combined with perseverance, and for this to be persisted with until the mind became calmed and a sense of divine peace enjoyed. To keep on repeating a text or statement of truth about the Absolute is not a vain repetition as some critics declare. It entails concentration through perseverance, and a persistent reaching towards the eternal, the result of which is that after a time the mind begins to pay attention, and becomes conformed to the truth which we so perseveringly utter. As has been said so often, the mind can contain only one kind of thought at one time, so that if we succeed in filling it with those of truth, then thoughts of fear and other harmful suggestions are shut out, so that the mind can abide quietly in the truth which makes men free. It was soon after the Science of Thought Review had been established that I became acquainted with the late Princess Karaja, founder of the White Cross Union and also well known as a seer. Princess Karaja wrote several books in which she displayed a profound knowledge of esoteric and occult matters which was quite beyond me. She also wrote some articles for the Science of Thought Review, but these were so abstruse as to be quite beyond our readers and my understanding, so I stopped publishing them. Once when in London and having an hour to spare, I visited Princess Karaja. She told me many interesting and extraordinary things, the most of which I have long forgotten, but I do remember that she touched upon the mysteries of the Great Pyramid, and held some interesting theories about the axis of the earth which, she declared, was in process of being changed. She also told me that, to her, my eyes appeared luminous, like electric lamps set in alabaster. I did not pay much attention to this at the time, but I have since been told the same thing by others. Also sometimes when I have been speaking at a small meeting where we were all of one mind, in one place, people have remarked afterwards that they had difficulty in looking at me because I appeared to emit rays of brilliant white light. I have since been told that this is by no means unusual, and that the same phenomenon has been observed in certain preachers. I dismissed all this from my mind, looking upon it as so much imagination, but I had to change my mind sometime later. A lady called on me, I think she came from India, whose eyes were distinctly luminous, like electric lamps set in alabaster. Indeed, the whole of the upper part of her head appeared indistinct to me because of the luminosity which enveloped it. As I am not psychic or clairvoyant, I had to admit that there might be something in what Princess Karaja and other people had told me. But this luminosity in my visitor was not the rather hard and glittering light seen in certain portraits and drawings supposedly illustrating psychic subjects. Instead, it was a soft and heavenly kind of radiance which is only visible to those who are living in a higher consciousness. My visitor was a very spiritually minded woman. Consequently, after this incident I began to look more closely at people, and I noticed that the majority of people, being unawakened, had a dead, putty-like appearance, but here and there I would find one whose face was full of light. In those cases where I got to know people who had the light upon their faces, I found that they were praying people, that is, they had daily intercourse with God. So that explained the whole subject. The dull, putty-like faces belonged to unawakened people who had no intercourse with God, while those who had the light shining through their faces were those who walked and talked with God. God is light, God within us is the only reality about us, and God is light. That was the true light, which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. I have found, however, that a person's religious views have little or nothing to do with the matter. Indeed, I knew a man of limited views who belonged to an extremely narrow, an exclusive sect, yet who had the light on his face and wore a heavenly expression. His doctrinal beliefs were to me wholly unacceptable, yet B had the light upon his face because B was a praying man. When I was young, one of my friends was a Baptist minister, a very good man but very denominational and exclusive in his views. He, like all his fellow ministers, had one pet aversion, high church, but in spite of their exclusiveness they tolerated low church. After a few years we lost touch with one another, and it was nearly 40 years before life brought us together again. I found that my ministerial friend had broadened considerably in his outlook. One of the things which gave him seriously to think was an incident which once happened in the course of his ministerial duties. The Free Church ministers held a meeting once a month, and to it the Anglican Church sent a delegate in the person of a curate. What the Free Church ministers would have liked would have been a Low Church curate whose doctrinal views were similar to their own. But to their chagrin they were informed that a very High Church curate had been appointed, so they hoped for the best and prepared for the worst. But when the curate arrived, my friend had the shock of his life. The newcomer was so possessed of the Holy Spirit, so obviously a child of the light and so full of divine power, that all those present noticed a difference when he came into the room. The spiritual temperature became raised directly he arrived. The light and power remained as long as he was in the meeting, but when he left they departed with him, leaving the gathering empty and cold. It was obvious, my friend said, that the curate possessed something which they did not, and this made him think, especially as later on the High Church curate left the town, and his place was taken by a Low Church curate whose doctrinal views were all that the ministers could have desired, but who possessed neither the light nor the power. My friend came to the conclusion that doctrinal views and beliefs are not everything. The reason why the first curate had the light and the power was that he was a praying man. He had intercourse with God for hours every day, and never allowed anything to prevent it. There are some who say that the light is not in every man, that it is only given to a few. When I was young, fierce controversies raged over what was called Calvinism, whose adherents contended that only a favored few were predestined to be children of the light, while on the other hand members of the opposing camp, called Arminians, averred that this was a dreadful mistake, and that anyone could become a child of the light just whenever he chose. Today the same question arises in a new form: is the light in every man, or is it in only a few? Those who say that it is have the support of John, who said that the light lighteth every man coming into the world. Those who say that the light is only in a certain few can however quote the parable of the wheat and the tares, the wheat typifying the children of the light, while the tares represent those who have not the light. Also they can quote Jesus as saying that truth was kept from some in case they might hear and understand and be converted. And so the controversy continues. Note by Margaret Lee: why would one want to know that? The whole discussion seems to be just like the one of the apostles regarding a hierarchy in heaven. They thus demonstrated they had no understanding of life in heaven. We should see the Spirit of God in everyone and everything, then that will be all we experience. This has caused me much thought. While it is true that if we look into the faces and eyes of some people, it does not seem possible that there can be any inward light within them at all, oftentimes they seem to be bereft even of soul, yet I believe that the light is actually there, though covered by so many wrappings of self, as to be undiscernible. It is true, of course, that the vast majority of people never, from the cradle to the grave, show any signs of spiritual awakening. They are born into irreligious homes, never receive any devotional instruction, and also seem to have no spiritual faculty at all. Anything of a religious matter seems to be entirely beyond their comprehension. Yet in spite of this I still believe that the light lighteth every man that cometh into the world, even as John said. It is true also that John records Jesus as saying, "No man can come to me, except the Father draw him." But this need not be read to mean that God draws a favored few and not the remainder, or that some are so constituted as to be incapable of responding. We can interpret it as meaning exactly what it says, viz., that we cannot reach the light by our own efforts. What happens is that we respond to the softening and drawing power of God's love. We love Him because He first loved us, but we cannot do that even of ourselves, for there is nothing in the natural man that can respond to the divine influence. It is because God's Spirit is in us that we are able to respond. In fact, it is the Spirit in us which responds, and when in course of time we enter into full realization and know God, whom to know is life eternal, it is the Spirit in us who knows, for only God can know God. But if this is so, it may be asked, how is it that the majority of people remain unawakened and pass from the cradle to the grave without manifesting any signs of the light that is in them? My answer is that everyone is not at the same stage of unfoldment. Some are very much in the beginner stage, others are a little more advanced, while yet others are still more advanced. And so we proceed right up the scale to the fully awakened and illumined soul who becomes merged into union with God. According to the teaching of Jesus, we live eternally with the Father and make a journey into a far country, and then, having gained knowledge through experience, we return to the home from which we departed. Owing, I suppose, to the teaching of the parable of the prodigal son, the Church allows belief in the pre-existence of the soul. Some of us know that interiorly we are eternal beings, and that this existence here is but an incident in an endless life. Some believe, like Princess Karaja, that we come here many times to gain experience, but I am not prepared to accept this. God is infinite, and His ways are infinite, and there may be many other worlds to conquer. In my Father's house are many mansions, said Jesus. I think that it is wiser to leave the matter with Him. Jesus describes it very picturesquely as keeping our lamp under a bushel, or bowl, or corn measure. He says that we should not do that, but instead should bring it out of its covering and place on a lampstand, so that all who are in the house can see it. Now my experience has been that it takes a long time to remove the wrappings from the lamp within. But each battle of the soul, each victory won, and every grief and sorrow faithfully borne tend to remove something from that which keeps the light hidden. Gradually but surely, however, the wrappings become less until at last we become conscious of the light within, that true light which lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Another thing which Princess Karaja told me was that love rays which were beating upon this planet would increase in intensity, and that as they did so the inhabitants of the earth who were not attuned to them would become increasingly violent and rebellious. She explained that the love which brings joy and bliss to one who is attuned it has an agonizing effect upon those who are unattuned. This she told me in 1923, and subsequent events have tended to support her view. After I left the princess I felt lifted up for days, but I did not feel that her kind of teaching was for me, so shortly afterwards we parted. It is strange that I should have to go to an occultist, in order to learn as never before that God is love, and cannot anything else but love. And in due course I came to realize that we are not punished for our sins, but by our sins. The father of the prodigal son did not punish the boy but only loved him. The son was, however, punished severely by his sins. In other words, he punished himself by departing from his father's home. It was in this way that I came to a realization that God is love, and that He never has been anything else but love. How lovely it is to come to this liberating realization. But what a long time we take to come to this great truth, how reluctant we are to trust our best friend. Postscript. Since writing the above I have been privileged to have another lady visitor whose face shone with the light of heaven. She seemed to be enveloped in the light, but it was when she spoke of the things of God that it became most evident. Then the light seemed to well up from within, and to me her face became less distinct owing to the glory which shone from it. I can quite understand that Moses had to put a veil over his face after being so long with the Lord. There was an interesting sequel. My visitor and her husband kindly sent me a photograph of themselves, taken together. In it the faces of both are bright with heavenly joy, but behind the wife can be discerned a blaze of light. It is an interesting fact that a photograph will record that which would be invisible to the ordinary onlooker, and those who are spiritually unawakened would see nothing exceptional if they were to meet my visitor. Chapter 6, On Feeling. On looking back over my life, and especially during the last 30 or 40 years, one thing is very clear to me, namely, that feeling is a greater power than thought. This may seem to be a strange statement to make, in view of my many writings on the power of thought. For instance, I can see that when, about the year 1906, I started making demands upon the infinite, it was not so much the thoughts expressed or the words used which produced such a startling change in my circumstances, as the intense feeling which I put into the words, which turned my life literally upside down. Therefore my statement neither weakens nor contradicts anything that I have ever said as to the necessity of right thought, for this is of the utmost importance. But it is necessary that we should feel what we think, otherwise the thought has but little power. This was brought home to me once when one of our readers explained in a letter that although she had been left a widow without means, she had never had any difficulty about money, and this she attributed to the fact that she always felt rich. If we feel rich, then we find that our modest needs are supplied, and in addition we have something to give away. But if we feel poor, then everything seems to run away from us. It is the same with regard to health. If in spite of our ill health we can feel well, in an inward way, then it is not long before we find that we are well. Many will ask, how can one feel well when one is ill? The answer is that if one is really ill or suffering from complete breakdown, then the only thing to be done is to rest and allow others to minister to us. But if it is only ill health from which we are suffering, then to feel well is a great aid to being well. The fact that so many people do not respond to metaphysical and spiritual healing is due very largely, I believe, to their knowing and thinking too much. The best patients, so the late Mr. Hickson found, were those who are generally called natives, that is, those who have not been spoilt by civilization. The people who know or think they know everything about healing, and who can give us all the answers are, generally speaking, those who are never healed. It is one thing to know with the head, and quite another thing to know with the heart. Head knowledge is a hindrance. That is why in order really to know God we have to lay aside all that we have learned about God. We continue to do this until at last we have cast away the last thread of our so-called knowledge. Then when we have reached nothing, we find that we have found everything. The way of attempted understanding through head knowledge becomes more, and yet more complicated the farther we advance. On the other hand, the way of understanding through the heart becomes simpler and yet simpler the more we advance. We have to get beyond thought in order to enter into ultimate truth. When we have cast aside all our acquired knowledge, we come to that which has always been. When we cease our thinking, we glide out onto the ocean of God's peace, we become aware of and feel the bliss of divine union. So long as we struggle and strain to find God, through thinking and understanding with the head, we clamp down a sort of iron lid on our intuitive faculty which most effectively prevents us from entering into the liberty and freedom of direct knowing. St. Paul speaks of a veil which is between us and God, but he says that, when it, the heart, turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. He does not say that through much mental seeking we can get through the veil, but that when we turn our heart, the feeling part of us, to the Lord, then the veil is taken away. This I have found to be true in my own experience. All intellectual attempts on my part have proved themselves to be but broken cisterns. It is only through feeling and intuition that I have found the well of water, within my own being, springing up into everlasting life. All the while the terrible iron lid presses down upon us, we live a life that is separate and alone, and no matter how much we may strive to remove it, we completely fail. It cannot be got rid of by resisting it, but only by acceptance and surrender. This is indeed a paradox. The very thing which is pressing us down now is the very thing which will later raise us up and set us free. In my own case, I have had to make many surrenders, each one of which at the time was thought by me to be complete and final. Each one in turn, however, proved to have been only partial, so yet another had to be made, until at last I could go no lower and could do no more, but simply cast myself into the abyss. One of our readers once wrote a poem about this very thing. In it she described a very definite and authentic spiritual experience in which she found herself hanging at the end of a rope which she was clutching with all her strength, in order to save herself from dropping into a bottomless pit. She seemed to hear a voice, saying, "Let go of the rope." But she was afraid to do so, for apparently that would have meant the annihilation of her soul. That is what we all have to face at some time or other, actual death, or so it seems. We know that although our body may die, yet we do not die, but in this terrific experience, annihilation of our soul or real individuality is what faces us. It really seems that if we leave off fighting to retain our life, and let go of the rope, so to speak, that will really be the end of us. At last, however, she let go, and immediately found herself caught in the arms of God. She had solved the great mystery. She knew the inner meaning of the words of Jesus. She had lost, given up, her life, and in so doing had found it, the real life of the eternal. The iron lid of self separates us, in consciousness, from God, pressing down upon us so that we cannot breathe freely. But directly we let go, the oppression ceases and we are able to breathe freely, down to the deepest depths and right up to the highest heights, without let or hindrance. It is like an elephant, to us a clumsy metaphor, being transformed into a bird on the wing. I am imagining, of course, that an elephant must feel very earthbound, whereas a bird must feel delightfully airborne anyway. That is how we feel when we gather up the courage to let go. We are reminded of the words in Isaiah, "They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength, they shall mount up with wings as eagles." At last we have discovered our true place in the whole. Like the heavenly bodies, we find ourselves perfectly poised and balanced, moving along our appointed orbit without effort. Ours is an effortless life, in which everything takes place at the right time and in a divinely orderly way. We are perfectly at home in God. We can lean back on the sustaining infinite and be at rest. Or, we can float out onto the ocean of God's peace. At the same time, paradoxically enough, we feel God's inward peace flowing through us like a river. We realize with joy the reality of the divine order, and that it is everywhere present and that we are really never separated from it. In it everything comes to pass at the right time. I cannot describe how perfectly at home I feel in God. Feel is the right word, for it is a feeling of bliss infinite. It is beyond thought, therefore we have to cease our thinking in order to experience it. Thought can bring us only to the foot of the mountain of truth, after which we have to proceed by intuition and feeling. No one can know the bliss of divine union, of being completely at home in God, through thinking about it or trying to understand or know it intellectually. It can only be experienced and felt. How can we reach this stage? Is there no open sesame, no secret formula available to us? I do not know of any such secret and easy way. The way I have come has been one of seeking, ever seeking and trying this and trying that, in an effort to find some secret and magical war of attainment, but all such efforts have been in vain. As I look back, I can see that life has been the great initiator in my own case through the ordinary experiences of life, experiences such as are common to all of us. These are the great initiator. When once we have surrendered to the will of the whole and have dedicated our life to the quest, each experience which comes to us is perfectly designed by infinite wisdom and infinite love to advance us towards divine union. That is, of course, if we meet each experience in the right way, in a spirit of cooperation instead of resentment or self-pity. It makes such a difference when we realize that we are being guided by infinite wisdom and infinite love, and that each experience is designed for our good, and that if we meet it with acceptance and deal with it in love, it will be found to be a blessing, raising us to higher and better things. If we meet an experience with resentment or self-pity, then it is turned into what looks almost like a curse. On the other hand, if we meet it with acceptance and cooperation, we find that all things work together and fit together in a most wonderful way, and that each experience brings us nearer to the heart of God. It was a great day for me when the realization came to me that love is behind all life's experiences, and that the secret of life is simply love. Directly I realized this, I could see that love had been at work in my affairs all the way through, and that the disorders of my life were due to my working against love instead of cooperating with it. Gradually my outlook became more cosmic. I could see the unfoldment of God's plan and purposes, both in the great and the small things of life. I could see that the divine order is everywhere present and is not something that will come to pass in the future. The kingdom or realm of God is with us now and always. Now is the accepted, or acceptable, time. Behold, now is the day of salvation. The whole of God's infinitude is available at any given point, now. An infinitude of joy, an infinitude of peace, an infinitude of wholeness, could we but realize it. It was also a great day when I realized that whereas I had been seeking God all my life, apparently in vain, yet the actual truth of the matter was that God had been seeking me, and trying to bring every possible blessing into my life. Again, it was a great day in my experience when the understanding came to me that God is at work, in the life of each one of us, as much in the life of one as in that of another. The way in which love has blessed us, and followed us all our days is both wonderful and glorious, but we are not the favorites of divine mercy. Everyone is being dealt with by the Spirit in a perfect way, according to infinite wisdom and infinite love, but we are all at different stages of unfoldment. The majority of people are not even spiritually awakened, while amongst those who are awakened many are at quite an elementary stage. But they are all in the love and care of God, and each one is in his right place at the time. A tadpole is not a frog, but he is a good tadpole. That is all that matters. In the divine order, everything comes to pass at the right time, and each one of us is in his right place, at the right time, and doing his right work. Many years were to pass before, after countless experiences, I was privileged to be given the inner understanding or revelation that God has a place and a use for each one of us. He has a place for the heroic pioneer who dares all and climbs the heights. He also has a place for those who keep to the lowlands and who remain with the herd. Each is equally dear to the heart of God. Each is of equal importance. Each has his place in the family of God. Some have been perturbed because their loved ones have passed on without shewing any evidence of having been spiritually awakened, but all this passes away when it is revealed to us that God has a place for everyone, each at his respective stage. The reason why so many people are unhappy about their loved ones who do not follow the religious life, and who may have passed on without shewing signs of soul awakening, is due to the old idea that God is a God of wrath and punishment, and not as he really is, infinite wisdom, love and compassion. There was once a little French priest whose duties included ministering to the dying, many of whom were hard cases and passed over still unrepentant. This made the little priest most unhappy, and he was very miserable over the fate of those who died in their sins. He continued to be very unhappy and, indeed, became increasingly so until one day he had a revelation of the love of God, and that God is love, and can never be anything different from love. Our little priest became a changed man. He was full of joy and peace, and love and compassion. He gladly ministered to the dying, no matter how sinful they had been, for did he not know that God was love? The realization that God is love was a revelation to me, so also was the fact that soul awakening comes to a man only at the right time, and that it cannot come at any other time. God is at work in our life, all the time, even when we may be following strange gods and relying upon broken cisterns. The French priest knew that all was well with those who died outside his church, because he knew that God was and is love, and has never been anything else. As I have stated elsewhere, what is termed the wrath of God is not wrath at all, but the love and order of God from which man has departed. The greater the love, the more painful it is for the one who is out of correspondence with it. The story of the prodigal son is a perfect example of what happens to one who departs from his father's home. He is not punished by his father, but he punishes himself by placing himself outside the order and harmony of his true home. The farther he wanders away, the more acute his sufferings become. In the revelation of St. John we read of the great ones of the earth hiding in caves, and crying to the mountains and rocks, "Fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand?" What this means is that the love rays being poured out upon this planet are to be intensified. This will bring increasing joy to those who are attuned to divine love, and increasing discomfort to those who are out of tune. Love would appear as wrath to those who are not attuned to it. The more unlike love they are, the greater will the wrath appear to be. But, of course, there is no wrath, but only love. It would be the same with one given to impurity. If such a one were confronted by absolute purity, he would indeed want to cry to the rocks and mountains to fall on him and hide him. Of course it is of the utmost importance that those who die should at the time of passing have their attention directed to God and Christ, and that they should be in a state of forgiveness towards those who have wronged them. Those who minister to the dying always try to get the one who is dying to forgive those whom he feels he simply cannot forgive, and also to look to God, or to Jesus Christ. This is all most helpful to the soul of the dying, but if it cannot be accomplished, then we have the satisfaction of being able to fall back on the joyous fact that God is love, and that he can never be anything less than love, and that he is love to all eternity. Now I began this chapter by writing of feeling. I do not know truth through the intellect, I know God who is love through love. I cannot know him through my mind, but only through my heart. In other words, my heart responds to love, so that I feel God. And thus it is through feeling that I know, and not through reasoning. Because God is love, it is necessary that in order to know God, we too must become love, for only God, love, can know God, love. It follows, therefore, that we can really know God only through feeling. We feel this power of love in the region of the solar plexus, or what in the Bible very probably is termed the heart. This is the part of our body where we experience an all-gone feeling when we are dominated by a great fear. One poor man said to me, when he was in great trouble and stricken with fear, that he felt as though he had no inside. Yet when he regained his sense of realization of the presence of God, that was the very place where he felt full to bursting with power. In this connection I am reminded of a verse in Hosea, "And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said unto them, Ye are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, Ye are the sons of the living God." Yes, in the very place where we felt lost and all gone, in that very place we feel the power of the sons of the living God. In order to become filled with divine power, it is necessary that we should cultivate feeling, as distinct from knowing by the head. The more advanced we grow, the simpler truth becomes. In order to know God, we have to discard all our knowledge about God until there is nothing left. Then when we have come to nothing, we find that we have found everything. We have to lose our life in order to find it. All the complicated teachings which we may have studied can now be put aside. Doctrines, theories, esoteric mysteries can all be discarded, for having served their purposes they can now be consigned to the limbo of forgotten things. Now that I know God, I want to know nothing about God. All that is necessary for me now is for me to be still and know God. All that I need now is to know God's inward peace, to immerse myself in the deep river of God's peace, and at the same time to feel it flowing through me. Thus the great mystery of the ages is solved, we in God, and God in us. Not as a theory or doctrine but as an actual, factual experience. Daily we can sit quietly, knowing God. We do not try to define God, for God is beyond all definition, we simply become still and know. We feel the one life, deep within our being, and find that our own life has infinite extensions, beyond time and space. No longer do we seek God with our head, we know Him with our heart. Deep down within us we find God's inward peace. We breathe the sweet ether, blowing of the breath of God, as Edward Carpenter has it. We feel within our soul the pulsations of the one infinite life. And not only so, for as we sit in the great stillness, we realize that the presence of God is all around us, that we live and move and have our being in the one universal spirit. As we sit quietly, being still, and knowing, or feeling God, the rays of the divine life beat upon us and flow through us like wireless waves passing through the walls of a building. Then it seems as though our physical body dissolves, so that we become Holy Spirit. This indeed is the object of all religions, to get behind the material, to find the spiritual, to pass from the temporal to the eternal. I find now that it is no longer necessary to follow any set system of meditation and contemplation, but only to know God and to feel immersed in His peace, and to feel His peace flowing through me like a river. The end. You have heard My Search for Truth by Henry Thomas Hamblin, a creation of Rich and Spiritual.